They taught me how to heal, but no one prepared me to lose myself in the process, and that's exactly what I did. While I was saving him, little by little, I was fading away. The war didn't break me all at once. It unraveled me slowly, like a worn-out cloth surrendering to time. I walked into that tent with a purpose: to save lives, to clean wounds, to lift men who had fallen. But somewhere along the way, I stopped knowing who I was in the middle of those blood-stained cots and desperate prayers. My uniform said, nurse, but my heart, it no longer followed orders. Loving someone on the wrong side of the war was the highest price I ever paid. Not because I was punished, but because I stopped recognizing myself. Every choice I made, every sleepless night beside him, every lie I told to keep him safe, it all chipped away at the parts of me I once believed were unbreakable. And still, I saved him. Because I loved him. Because I had to. This emotional story isn't about patriotism. It's not even about romance. It's about what happens when you cross the line between duty and desire. And there's no way back. My name is Estelle Virginia Rowland. I'm 91 years old. I live in a small attic in Chicago. The kind of place where life hides between old things. A sewing machine that creaks more than it sews. Fogged up windows that never let the sunlight in fully. And a cage hanging from the ceiling that once held a canary, but now only holds silence. During the war, I was a nurse at a secret hospital in Warsaw. Red Cross. Night missions. I was good at what I did. Cold when I had to be. Steady like a woman surrounded by gunpowder was expected to be. But it was there, between scalpels and morphine, that I met him. And before I even realized it, I was saving him more than I should, and forgetting myself more than I could afford to. Between one gauze pad and the next, my heart started jumping fences I would have never dared cross before the war. And suddenly, I couldn't tell if I was caring for him, out of compassion, or out of something deeper. What I know is, I didn't come back the same. And maybe I didn't come back whole. Sit here with me. The tea's lukewarm, but it'll still warm your chest. I want to tell you something I've never spoken out loud, but it's always screamed inside of me. Listen with your heart, sweetheart. And if this war story echoes anywhere in there, hit subscribe, leave a comment. Because sometimes what we need the most is just someone who'll listen without rushing. The smell of ether always calmed me. For a few minutes, it felt like the world inside that tent made sense. Clean lines, sterilized tools, the steady rhythm of footsteps from those who had learned to live among wounds. My uniform was always clean, or at least as clean as it could be, given the circumstances. I was methodical. I didn't like improvisation. I believed order was the only way not to lose my mind, that if I kept my body steady, my soul wouldn't fall apart. I was wrong. That day I remember the muffled sound of boots running outside, then the dragging of a body across the dirt floor. Another one. Another wounded enemy, they said. And with that always came the sideways glances, the whispers through clenched teeth. Why help him? Why waste morphine on someone who would shoot at us? But my answer was always the same. Because he's down. Because he's bleeding. Because I'm a nurse. But when I stepped into that makeshift surgical post and saw his face, something shifted. It wasn't magic. It wasn't love. It was something far stranger and far more dangerous. A heavy silence fell between us. He looked at me like I was the last living thing in a field of death. Not with anger, not with fear. With relief. Like he already knew me from some place untouched by war. He had a deep wound in his shoulder. Blood ran in thin streams across his narrow chest, through his torn uniform, past clenched teeth in pain. His skin was lighter than mine. His features were sharp, defined, hardened by cold. But what disarmed me was his gaze. He looked at me as a man, not as a soldier, and for a moment I forgot the protocols, the cloths, the scalpels, the penicillin bottles, and just stood there, caught between what I was trained to do and what I felt for the first time in months, that I also needed saving. The war had swallowed everything. My dreams, my faith, even my simplest habits. Like braiding my hair in the calm of the morning. I lived off scraps, slept sitting up, and did transfusions like prayers. I didn't know what life outside of screaming sounded like anymore. And suddenly, a man from the wrong side of the war was making me remember I was still alive. That's when the first doubt came. Not about him, about me. I was supposed to treat him like all the others. Follow protocol. Don't look too long. Don't care too much. But when I started cleaning his skin with warm compresses, I noticed my hands were shaking, a soft tremor, but enough to remind me I was made of flesh, not steel. That night I didn't speak about it to anyone. I went back to my tent, scrubbed my hands until they burned, and stared at my reflection in the little water tin. Everything looked the same. Hair tightly pinned, scarf tied at my neck, face expressionless, but inside, a crack had opened. And I knew from that moment on, every time I went back to care for him, another piece of me would slip through that fracture. My uniform was still clean, but my soul was already beginning to stain with doubt. The cot where they placed him was in the back of the tent, near the canvas divider that separated the non-urgent cases. That was where the breathing was slower, and sometimes stopped altogether. It was the place where tired eyes met, where silence spoke louder than any scream. And it was there, in that forgotten corner, that my world started to quietly fall apart, not with noise, but with wounds. The first time I cleaned him completely, I felt something I had never allowed myself to feel in that place. Slowness, not rush, not duty, not medical urgency, just slowness. My hands moved as if each gesture were an offering, not to him, but to the tiny piece of humanity still flickering inside me. I ran the cotton along the edges of his wound like someone caressing an altar, and each move, once so mechanical, now felt like a silent apology, as if I were saying without words, "Forgive me for saving you like this, for doing this without being allowed to love you. I had cared for hundreds of bodies before, but his body didn't seem to be asking for help. It simply accepted whatever came. There was a kind of surrender in him that unmoored me. He didn't speak, didn't smile, didn't cry. He just watched me with those deep-set eyes, as if he knew me better than I knew myself. And I started picking the cloths more carefully, heating the water just a little longer, wrapping his bandages with a kind of tenderness I hadn't shown even in my own thoughts in months. Other soldiers came and went. They moaned, they cursed, they shouted. But he just watched. And slowly, that corner of the tent stopped being just a place of recovery. It became my refuge, a sanctuary, a space where I didn't just tend to his wounds, but where I remembered who I was outside the rules of war, outside the gaze of commanders, outside the morality that had been shoved down my throat, because there, next to that cot, there was no right or wrong. There was just us. I kept a handkerchief in my pocket, one of mine, and used it to cover his eyes when the sun hit his face too harshly. A small gesture, but to me, it was a secret made of wool and the scent of lavender. The last thing I'd tucked into my suitcase before coming on this mission. Sometimes I'd let my hand linger on his forehead a second longer than needed, pretending to check for fever. But really, It was longing, longing for something that never was. But in that cot somehow felt possible. With every dressing change, it felt like I was stitching a veil between myself and the rest of the world. And the more time I spent with him, the further I drifted from the other nurses, from the protocols, from the war itself. I was building a world within the war. A world that only existed between that sweaty canvas, that iron cot, and the man I was told to hate. When I left that corner, my legs would tremble. Not from exhaustion, from conflict. It felt like I'd stepped into something sacred. And now I was walking back into the profane. The war demanded I be cold, quick, rational. But there, at that makeshift altar, I was just a woman in love with a secret that had no name, and with a man who might never be mine. The smell of his blood stayed on my hands for days, but more powerful than the scent was the presence, the invisible weight he left in me. And I knew, from that moment on, that cot would never again be just a place to heal. It was the altar where, without realizing it, I had begun to sacrifice myself. His name was unpronounceable to me at first. It had harsh, guttural sounds, wrapped in a language I didn't understand, and honestly, didn't want to learn. It was easier that way. A name gives shape, it gives identity, it creates a bond. And I still believed that keeping emotional distance was a way to survive. But his eyes, his eyes needed no translation. They were deep, dark like a mine shaft, yet somehow reflected light, like they held fire inside. And the most unsettling part, they looked at me without hate, as if sides didn't matter, as if in that canvas and smoke cocoon, we were just two tired souls clinging to the last flicker of warmth, the last piece of humanity. I never called him by name. I never heard him say mine. But our eyes, they called each other every single day. I'd walk in, and he'd already be waiting. Even if he pretended to sleep, even if he didn't move. The moment I got close, his lashes would hesitate. That heavy eyelid would twitch. And when he finally opened his eyes, it felt like a silent chord hummed between us. A code. A ritual. And that started consuming me. Because on the outside, I was still Estelle, the efficient nurse, the one who washed her hands with discipline, the one who could stitch wounds without trembling. But inside, I was a flame burning too hot to put out on my own. And it all started with those eyes that never begged, never demanded, but always said, "I know you see me." With the soldiers on our side, the look was always the same. Urgency, pain, sometimes desperation, often disdain. But him, he looked different. He looked at me like I was whole. And that was more dangerous than any military threat. Because in there, between syringes and bandages, I didn't feel like a soldier or a professional. I felt like a woman. It was in his eyes that I saw who I really was, not who the world told me to be. And that's addictive. No one tells you that love doesn't begin with touch or words. It starts the moment you're seen, fully seen. And after that, there's no going back to being invisible. That's how I began to crave the cold dawns, the night shifts, the bandage changes no one else wanted. Not because I loved the job, but because I needed to see him again. And I hated needing that. Hated it. Because every time I looked at him, a part of me revolted. I no longer knew if I was saving him or clinging to him so I wouldn't drown. I had become the minefield myself. Every feeling, a potential explosion. Every silence between us one step deeper into something I couldn't come back from. Sometimes I caught myself staring too long, much too long, and I'd have to look away, pretend I was grabbing a thermometer, writing down a reading. Because if someone noticed, if someone saw, it would all fall apart. But he already knew. He knew. And his eyes said so. Said everything without ever speaking. In war, they teach you how to protect yourself. From bullets, from bombs, from cold, from hunger. But no one teaches you how to protect yourself from a gaze that sees all of you, and still chooses to stay. His name never mattered, but his eyes were the mirror that showed me exactly what I was about to lose. Myself. I never thought I'd lie for someone, especially not during wartime, when every word spoken could cost a life. We nurses were trained to document everything. Time, temperature, condition, uniform, codes. One mistake on a chart could mess up a supply route, an evacuation, even a life-or-death decision. But that morning, clipboard in hand and pencil between my fingers, I wrote something that wasn't true. And for the first time I felt the sound of my own heart falter in my chest. Like even it was saying, "You just crossed the line." He wasn't supposed to be there. That cot, that tent, that emergency post. It was only for Allied soldiers. He was an intruder, a stranger, a name no superior wanted to see listed among our own. And yet, I couldn't bring myself to leave him off the page. I should have written, "Unidentified foreigner, transfer for interrogation." But my hand shook, and what came out was, "Shrapnel wound, incomplete identification, awaiting stabilization." 3 words that knocked the air out of me. Incomplete identification. That was enough. Enough to stall, to blur the trail, to buy time. Time I didn't even know why I wanted, only that I needed it. Time to keep seeing him. Time not to turn him in. Time to save him and lose a little more of myself along the way. I walked back to my barrack that day like I had lead in my legs. The canvas flapped in the wind, but everything sounded mute. And the hardest part wasn't the lie itself. It was how easy it felt to tell it. It didn't hurt to do it. What hurt was how natural it had become. As if something inside me had already been shaped for this. As if right and wrong had quietly switched places, and I hadn't even noticed. From that moment on, I started living on a razor's edge. Constant fear that someone would reread my report, that someone would question me. There was always a voice in the back of my mind whispering, "You stained the paper. You stained your name." But another voice, quieter, deeper, more stubborn, kept saying, "You did what had to be done." I kept going back to that tent, kept tending to him with the same precision that had earned me the respect of the others. But now, every touch carried a new weight. I was no longer just the nurse. I was the accomplice, the keeper of a secret, and worse, the one who had written it. I started hiding things, jotting down vitals on the backs of disposable slips, changing bandages without reporting it, giving him silent instructions with my eyes. Stay still, stay quiet, stay invisible. And he always understood, always. It was like we spoke a language made only of fear and trust, a language no one else spoke, because no one else dared to live that way. After that first lie, more came. Small ones, tiny ones, but all with the same goal, to protect him. And the more I protected him, the more I realized I didn't know if I was doing it out of compassion or out of need. Because the truth is, at that point in the war, he was the only thing that still made me feel. The rest of the world had turned to noise, and he was the center of my silence. There's no scalpel sharp enough to cut through guilt the way it deserves. No penicillin to cure this kind of fever. And the worst part of all was realizing that my greatest betrayal wasn't against the army. It was against myself. You never really notice the exact moment when you begin to change. There's no trumpet, no warning in the sky. Sometimes transformation comes like a soft breeze brushing your neck, and when you turn around to look, you're no longer who you were the day before. That's how it was with me. And what changed first was the volume of my voice. I used to be known for speaking firmly. Projected voice, clear commands. In the triage room, no one interrupted me. People said I carried myself like a commander, even without the rank. But slowly I began to shrink. My voice, my steps, my requests. I started speaking more softly, pulling my words inward, as if every sentence could carry more than just sound, as if it might betray what my body was already struggling to hide. I noticed it one gray morning, when the post was overcrowded and screams came from every direction. An American soldier had lost 2 fingers. He was shouting from pain, from rage, from fear. He was screaming for all the others, who never got the chance to. I ran to him, tried to stabilize the wound, gave him morphine, all on autopilot. But my voice, at that moment when I should have been yelling for gauze or a compress, came out shaky, soft, guilty, because deep down, I knew. I knew that while this soldier screamed, the man I was hiding was in the back of the tent, alone, vulnerable. And yes, I wanted to be there for the American soldier, but a part of me wanted to run to the other one, to see if he was still breathing, to see if he was still waiting for me. That was the day I realized. I no longer called out to the other nurses the same way. I started whispering, nodding instead of speaking, cutting conversations short in the hallways. And it wasn't just fear of being found out. It was an unconscious attempt to dissolve into the background, as if lowering my volume would erase my traces, as if speaking softer could protect not only him, but me too. Instead of laughing with the other girls at the end of the shift, I started smiling with my eyes and turning away. My steps no longer echoed across the wooden floors. I walked lightly, like someone who didn't want to be remembered. Because deep down, I was already someone else. A woman with secrets clinging to the roof of her mouth. A woman who no longer knew what it felt like to sleep in peace. And there was more. Even the way I spoke to him had changed. At first, I kept my distance. Spoke like I was giving orders. Then I started using a tone only we understood. A tone that wasn't medical, wasn't military. It was intimate, almost tender. Even if I didn't know whether he understood every word, I spoke like I was lulling him to sleep, like I was whispering so no one else could hear what, deep down, I wanted to scream. It was around then that I stopped humming while preparing medicine, a silly habit I'd had since before the war. I've always been the kind to hum so I wouldn't cry, but even that disappeared. Silence began to settle not just around me, but inside me. And ironically, he was the one occupying that space. My world shrank without me noticing. And my voice, it was the first part of me to go quiet. But not the last. During the war, anesthesia was a luxury. Most procedures were done with haste and hope. And when we ran out of morphine, we relied on whatever was left of human endurance. Bite down on cloth, hold your breath, pray. But with him, I always gave a little more. Not just because I feared he might feel pain, but because the truth that still stings to admit, is that I wanted to see him asleep, still, quiet, harmless. When he slept, I could look at him without fear. I could tend to his wounds with the calm of someone touching something no one else would ever see. When his eyes were closed, I had time to collect my thoughts, to remember who I was, to make up reasons that justified why I kept returning to that tent. But over time, I noticed something odd, even when there were no open wounds left, even when his pain was minimal. I kept sedating him. Only, the dose wasn't really for him. It was for me. I needed him to sleep. I needed to turn off his eyes, his body, his presence, because his awareness unraveled me. The silence between us was beautiful, yes, but also unbearable. He saw me. He felt me. And that exposed me, stripped me more than any touch ever could. It was as if each time I walked into that tent and found him awake, my armor began to crack. So I measured the dose carefully, almost lovingly, just enough to dull his senses but keep his vitals steady. And on the outside, I told myself it was for his own good, for the pain, for recovery. But deep down, I knew. It was my way of escaping myself, of living a silent love, and then switching it off like it was possible to shut down what you feel. That's when I started to lose myself, because the anesthesia I gave him, I started giving to me. I became colder with the others, more distant from the nurses. I avoided hot meals, long showers, the little notes they passed to get through the day. I denied myself the few small pleasures the war still allowed, because everything I felt, all that remained of my emotions, I saved for him, and then smothered them in silence and guilt. I started using logic as a shield. I told myself it was just compassion, that caring for him more carefully was part of the job, that keeping someone sedated was standard practice, but none of it was true. I just didn't want to face the fact that I no longer had control over what I felt. The anesthesia was my defense mechanism, my way of pretending I wasn't involved. That I was still the same woman who had stepped into the war with a vow to save lives, without getting attached to any. But I wasn't her anymore. In medicine, we're taught that the body can develop a resistance to anesthesia. And I became resistant to my own. The more I tried to numb, the more I felt. The more doses I gave, the stronger he returned. Not in flesh, but in presence. He became a part of me. And even asleep, even unconscious, he filled my thoughts with the kind of force that didn't need words to take over everything. In the end, the one who needed relief the most was me. It was a thin fabric, worn down by harsh soap and hurried hands. A plain sheet, no embroidery, no scent, no story. At least not until that day. Because on that day, that piece of cloth became both a wall and a bridge. It marked the line between who I had been and who I was becoming. And at the same time it joined two souls the war would never allow to love. I remember it clearly. The night was cold, the tent floor damp, as it always was after melting snow seeped through the corners. The air smelled of expired antiseptic, old sweat and spent candles. The other nurses had been called to the amputation unit. I stayed behind. I stayed because I wanted to, because I knew he'd be there. And that shift. There'd be no one else between us. He was already getting better. Breathing without strain. Sitting up slowly. And that night, for the first time, he asked me, not with words, but with a barely noticeable gesture, to cover him. Not from cold, but from shame. He was exposed, fragile, broken, and I, in silence, obeyed. I picked up the sheet and, as I laid it over him, my hand brushed the skin of his chest. Just a second. But the second that split me between the Estelle who healed and the Estelle who felt. I should have stepped back. Should have apologized, left the tent, taken a breath. But I stayed, and I pulled that sheet over him with more care than I'd ever shown anything before, as if I were folding part of myself and laying it between us. A boundary, a silent plea. Up to here. Beyond this. I'm still me. But it was useless, because even with that sheet between us, I had already crossed the line. He knew it, and so did I. In the dim tent, under the flickering light of a lamp that barely reached the corners, our eyes met. And in that moment, there were no uniforms, no war, no sides, only a silence that wrapped around us like a second blanket, heavier, warmer, more forbidden. I sat in the chair next to his cot, like I always did, but this time with no chart in hand, no clipboard, no thermometer. I just sat and stayed, watching the rise and fall of the sheet with his breath. And somehow, that tiny movement felt more intimate than any touch could ever be. That night, I realized what I was doing. I wasn't just saving a man. I was anchoring myself to him, holding on to his presence so I wouldn't drown in my own. He was the only place where I still existed as a woman, not just a role, not just a nurse, not a cog in a system that demanded I be useful, efficient, invisible. The sheet stayed between us, a thin line between right and wrong. But there were moments when the fabric shifted with the breeze, and in those moments, I saw it clearly. There was no more separation. I was already on the other side, and there was no way back. The world outside didn't know. The other nurses didn't suspect. But in that moment, I became the woman who chose to love, even when love was the most unforgivable mistake. And that sheet, that plain, lifeless sheet, became the white flag I never got to raise. We make promises without understanding their weight. When I graduated as a nurse, the oath felt like a beautiful formality. Words spoken, with a hand over the heart, the proud gaze of family in the audience, a silver pin fastened to a brand new sweater. We swore to serve, to care, to preserve life with dignity. We swore neutrality, compassion, respect. But no one tells you that one day your heart might disagree with what your lips promised, and that disagreement can eat you alive. In that makeshift tent, between blood-stained linens and the stench of burned flesh, I began to betray my oath, not with poison, not through negligence, but through choice. I chose to treat him gently. I chose to lie. I chose to stay silent. And worst of all, I chose to put him first. I knew what that meant. Every vial of antibiotics used on him was one less dose for one of ours. Every bandage changed too soon was a gesture someone could notice. And the worst part was, he never asked for any of it. He never begged, never pleaded for special care. It was me. I was the one who gave. I was the one who insisted. Because some part of me, a part starved for meaning, clung to the idea that loving this man was giving me back a more complete version of myself. But in the process, I was fracturing inside. I remember the day one of the supervisors casually asked about inventory. Supplies were low, and he wanted to know the status of our sulfur and serum stock. I answered with precision, calmly, but inside something stung, because one of those boxes had been opened early. Because of me. Because of him. I didn't sleep well that night. I lay there staring at the low ceiling of the barracks, listening to the sounds of a war that never truly paused. Distant gunfire, muffled cries, the cracking of wood. And in the middle of all that, what haunted me wasn't the fear of being caught. It was realizing that I was no longer who I swore I'd be. The oath wasn't broken with a scream. It dissolved slowly, like something being erased letter by letter. The Estelle who believed in neutrality no longer existed, because there, in that war, I chose a side, and it wasn't the side of my country, or of medicine, or of collective morality. It was the side of a man who spoke a different language, who fought under a different flag, but who saw me in a way no one else ever had. That haunts me to this day, because I always believed in duty. I was always driven by purpose, but love came like a slow fire. It didn't burn everything at once. It just singed the edges of the thing I valued most, my identity. I kept wearing the Red Cross pin on my chest, but it didn't weigh the same anymore. It was just an ornament. A reminder. A tiny piece of metal that said who I was supposed to be, not who I truly was. The silence of my betrayal was the hardest part to carry, because I couldn't confess. Not to him, not to myself. And the more I denied it out loud, the louder I felt it inside. I had made a choice, and that choice didn't need words. It was in what I didn't say, in what I hid behind my eyes. Because some oaths you betray just by breathing wrong in front of someone you were never meant to love. The uniforms arrived filthy, torn, soaked in grime, some stained with blood so dried it felt woven into the fabric. And we, the nurses, learned to look past them, to see the body, to treat the flesh, to forget the flag stitched on the chest. But with him, I could never ignore what his uniform meant. Even when I removed it with my own hands to clean his wounds, the symbolic weight stayed. Invisible, but unbearable. It was a different uniform from ours. The shade, the cut, the texture. But what hurt the most wasn't what it showed. It was what it hid. Behind that military cloth there was a man. A man who didn't ask for forgiveness but didn't seem guilty either. He didn't carry arrogance or hatred or justifications. He carried only exhaustion. And that exhaustion, that's what disarmed me. I started noticing something that unsettled me. The more I cared for him, the less his uniform felt like a threat, and the more it became a mirror. Because I wore one too. Not for combat, but still a uniform. That white apron, stained with the lives of others, was its own disguise. It was armor too. And I began to understand that we were both wearing layers just to survive. But the ache was in what those layers were hiding. There were days I caught myself staring at his clothes, hanging on the hook in the tent. That dried-out, carelessly folded uniform was more than fabric. It was a constant reminder of everything that kept us apart, and somehow, of everything that tied us together. Because I was trapped in a war I hadn't chosen too. I followed orders too. I hid my fear behind what I wore, just like him. There was one time he tried to speak. I don't know what he said. The language was broken, foreign. But his eyes were begging to be understood. I moved closer, not understanding the words, but understanding everything. I placed my hand on his shoulder and felt the tension in his muscle, just beneath the fragile skin. He was trembling, not from pain but from restraint. And I thought, how many times has this man had to bury his emotions just to survive? That's when I saw myself in him, because I was trembling too on the inside. I was choking on everything I couldn't say, just to keep up the performance. The only difference was, he wore a foreign uniform, and I wore a face too familiar to raise suspicion. His pain was invisible to everyone else, but I saw it, and seeing it broke me, because no matter which side you fight for, war tears away pieces no one ever sees. The uniform hides the blood, but not the memory. And as much as I told myself he was the enemy, my body already knew. The only real enemy was the one growing inside me, the doubt, the desire, the guilt. For years after the war, I dreamed of that uniform hanging on the hook. In the dream, it always slipped off by itself, and on the ground, it looked like it was breathing, like it was alive, like it still wanted to remind me that even though it wasn't there anymore, it still hurt me. Some wounds don't bleed. They stitch themselves into you from the inside out. And that's how I learned. The worst uniform I ever wore was the one I never took off. There was a day, I remember it clearly, when I walked into the tent and he wasn't there. Not because he had vanished, but because they had taken him to another ward for tests or reassessment. And that was all it took, just a few hours of absence. And I completely lost my footing. It felt like a part of me had been torn away, suddenly and without anesthesia. I didn't cry. I didn't panic. I just sat on the wooden bench and stared at the empty space like someone looking at a freshly sealed grave. That was the moment I realized it wasn't about him anymore. What I felt, that urgency, that need to see him, to hear him breathe, to run my fingers across the sheets just to be sure he was still there. It wasn't just love. It was something deeper, something darker. It was as if he had become the pillar holding up what little was left of my sanity. As if loving him had become the way I kept myself functional. The war was eating me from the inside out. I had no family nearby. I couldn't remember the sound of my own laugh. I no longer knew the taste of home-cooked food, or clean well water, or my mother calling my full name. Everything inside me had been silenced by gunfire, orders, blood, and repetition. And then he appeared, not with promises, not with flowers, but with pain, with fragility, with the same need I carried inside, to be seen. And I clung to that, desperately, so desperately that, without noticing, I stopped seeing him as a person. I started seeing him as an anchor, as a symbol, as the last piece of myself that still remembered what it meant to feel something. I watched his gestures like they were answers, the way he closed his eyes, the way his breath slowed when my hands moved across his chest. Everything became a sign. Everything became a prayer. And suddenly, I wasn't in love with a man anymore. I was entangled in my own emptiness. It hit hard, realizing I might be in love with something that wasn't even real, that maybe it was just a reflection of what I lacked, and I found myself trapped in a painful spiral. The more he healed, the more terrified I became of losing him. Because if he left, what would be left behind? The war, the cold nights, the sound of nothing pressing against the canvas walls, the absence, the memory, and me, once again alone with the hollow version of myself. During that phase, I started making mistakes, dropping tools, forgetting dates, mixing up charts. And no matter how much I tried to justify it, I knew my focus was no longer on the mission. It was on him. Or worse, on me, through him. And then, the question I'd avoided for so long came knocking without warning. Did I truly love him? Or did I just need him to keep myself alive inside a world that had already swallowed me whole? I didn't answer it. Not then. Because admitting that would have meant admitting that I had used that man, even without meaning to, as a lifeline. A castaway clinging to another. Two broken halves trying to float in a sea of ruin. It wasn't about him anymore. It was about the part of me I'd lost, and thought I'd found again in the eyes of a man the world had told me to hate. Out there the war was loud. Explosions shaking the ground, sirens slicing through the air, boots pounding in the mud, men shouting names no one would ever answer to again. It was a cruel orchestra, offbeat, without a score. But inside me, the noise was different. It was the steady sound of a heart that no longer beat out of duty. It beat out of longing, out of contradiction, out of love for someone the world told me to forget. I spent my days surrounded by collapsing bodies, but what truly terrified me was the open fracture inside my own soul. What kept me awake at night weren't the wounds I treated. It was the feelings I buried. As I stitched skin and stopped bleeding, a part of me was tearing open within. And that wound, no scalpel could mend. I tried to keep my composure, acted with precision. But inside, every time I saw him, it was like a new front opened up inside me, I was fighting a battle between what I was supposed to be and what I wanted to feel, and the pain of that clash was crueler than any war injury. On the surface, everything stayed the same. Reports, shifts, rushed prayers before each new patient. But deep in my chest, a battlefield was forming. On one side, my past, the values that led me to choose this path, the pride of serving. On the other, him. Not just as a man, but as a symbol, as a spark, as a threat to the fragile stability I clung to just to stay sane. There came a time when the sounds of the real war, bombs, screams, gunfire, started to feel distant to me. Like what happened outside the tent was a play performed by someone else, while the true battle was happening inside my body. My heart raced at the wrong moments. My hands sweated for no reason. I stared off into nothing, trying to remember who I was before all this began. And sometimes, I couldn't. I no longer knew if what I was doing came from love or self-preservation. Maybe he was just the last human gesture I had left, and I clung to that like a child clings to a blanket in the middle of a fire. We didn't speak, barely exchanged gestures, but in the quiet between us, my inner war screamed the loudest, because he never asked for anything, and still, everything about him demanded what was most dangerous in me: surrender. The war outside asked for weapons. The one inside asked for surrender, and I, a war nurse trained to endure, was growing tired of fighting myself. The exhaustion that weighed on me didn't come from sleepless nights or rows of wounded. It came from trying, day after day, not to love him more than I loved myself. But there was the breaking point. I no longer knew where he ended, and I began. Because sometimes the cruelest war is the one no one ever sees. It was on a cloudy morning, the kind where the light seeps through the canvas of the tent like a heavy fog. Colorless, slow, tired. I had just finished tending to 2 critical soldiers. Blood everywhere, one with a shattered jaw, the other missing his left leg. I did everything I could, more than I should have. But when it was over, instead of taking a deep breath and moving on to the next cot like I always did, I walked over to a small cracked mirror hanging behind the canvas screen. And there, I saw myself. Or rather, I saw a woman I no longer recognized. My hair was coming loose, my scarf slipping, my eyes sunken like caves that no longer held secrets. Just darkness. But that's not what frightened me. It was the emptiness, the absence of me, the feeling of staring into a familiar face and still knowing, somehow, that the woman in the reflection was someone I hadn't chosen to become. I touched my face, as if I could have somehow summoned the Estelle that existed before. The one who smiled easily, the one who cried during hymns, the one who believed in beginnings, middles, and endings. But all I found was a woman full of cracks, trying to hold up a war story no one had asked her to live. And I asked myself, with the kind of pain that never makes it to the lips, what's left of me? The other nurses still called me Miss Rowland, still respected me, still said I was someone to follow. But I knew I wasn't anymore. Because the woman who once swore not to get involved, not to break protocol, not to pick sides, was already buried somewhere in that underground hospital, and I was the one who had shoveled the final handful of dirt. That was the day I stopped writing in my journal. I used to record everything, even the small joys. A dried flower between the pages, a note from another nurse, the name of a soldier who beat the odds. But after I started caring for him, the pages stayed empty. First for lack of time, then for lack of courage, because writing is admitting. And I didn't want to admit how much I had changed, how much I had lost myself, and worse, how much I didn't want to go back. I walked through the tent in a body that didn't feel like mine anymore. My movements softer, almost resigned, as if my body had finally accepted that fighting what was happening inside me would hurt more than simply letting it be. I had become someone who accepted, who adapted, who lied with a quiet mouth, with lowered eyes, with the absence of resistance. In that cracked mirror, I saw two versions of me, the woman raised to obey, and the one who, in silence, chose to love what was forbidden. And between the two, there was only exhaustion, a kind of tiredness that didn't come from lack of sleep or long shifts. It was the weight of holding together a war within, while the world outside was already falling apart. And that's when I understood. It wasn't him who was changing me. It was me, trying to survive myself. In war, we're taught that loss is part of the process. Losing soldiers, losing sleep, losing track of the days. But no one tells us, no one ever prepares us, for the loss of ourselves. For that moment when, out of love, or duty, or sheer desperation, we have to let go of the one thing that kept alive the last flicker of light inside us. The day I decided to let him go wasn't dramatic. There was no speech, no letter, no movie scene kiss. It was an ordinary night, too quiet, even by war standards. The bombs in the distance had dulled. Soldiers' footsteps sounded heavier than usual. The wind moved the canvas walls like the tent itself was breathing. And there, in the corner of the barrack, he looked at me like he already knew. Like he'd felt it too. That time was running out. He could already walk. He moved with more strength. And with every day that passed, his presence there became more dangerous. For him, for me, for everyone. A nurse doesn't keep a man like him hidden for that long without drawing suspicion. I had begun to notice the stares, the veiled questions, the whispers that died the moment I walked by. I knew. I felt it. We were on the edge. And by then, there was no more pretending. I sat beside his cot like I had so many times before. But this time my hands were cold. I didn't touch his forehead. I didn't straighten his sheets. I just sat there, eyes fixed on the dirt floor, breathing slowly, like every inhale was a rehearsed goodbye. And when I finally looked up, he already understood. His eyes didn't ask anything. They just accepted. The way he always did. Accepted my presence, my help, my silence. And now, my absence. I didn't use words. I just walked to the corner, took the small canteen we kept hidden, with coins and scraps of metal, and slipped inside a folded note. Instructions. A map, simple, hand-drawn, scribbled in pencil with trembling fingers. The safest route to the back exit, the best time, the blind spots. It wasn't perfect, but it was possible. He took the paper like someone receiving a sentence, not of death, but of life, a life far away from me. I stayed there for hours. Every step away from him felt like a crucifixion, because by letting him go, I wasn't just saving him. I was signing my own emotional death warrant. Because after him, the world would go dark again. Food would lose its taste. The war would return to being nothing but noise. And I would go back to being just Estelle, just the nurse, just another uniform moving through rubble. That night, I didn't cry. I couldn't. Not there. Crying would have been admitting out loud that what we lived through was more than a passing mistake. It was real. It was love. It was mutual salvation. And losing that felt like losing the only living part of myself the war hadn't already stolen. When he slipped through the side flap of the tent, without looking back, everything in me wanted to scream. But I didn't scream. I just stood there, breath caught, eyes frozen in the stillness. And in that exact moment, I knew. I let him live, and buried myself with him. After the war, I came back with a small suitcase and a silence too big to fit inside it. The trains were crowded with soldiers returning home, some with medals, others with hollow eyes. I had no medals, and no home, just a borrowed room in a boarding house in Milwaukee, and a white coat folded at the bottom of a cardboard box, still damp with memory. It took me days to unpack. I left the box leaning in a corner like someone avoiding a wound that still throbs. But on a rainy night, the kind where the rain feels like it's trying to wash something more than just the streets, I opened it, and there it was, my coat, wrinkled with wear marks at the cuffs, a loose stitch on the shoulder, and the Red Cross pin still clinging to it with a crooked safety pin. The moment I touched the fabric, time came crashing back, and everything I'd buried groaned inside me. I washed it, twice, but his scent wouldn't come out. It wasn't his scent. It was the scent of where it all happened, the war, the tent, the damp soil and dried blood, and more than that, the scent of a woman who loved amid the rubble, and then buried that love along with the used bandages. I never had the courage to wear that coat again, not out of fear of what others would think, but because it was no longer a uniform. It had become a reliquary. Every stain that wouldn't lift, every crooked stitch, felt like a whisper of what was never spoken, as if the fabric itself held the memory of my secret, and to wear it again would be to open the Pandora's box I'd kept sealed for decades. I hung it on a hook behind the door, and there it stayed for years, silent, invisible to anyone who entered the room, but deafening to me. Sometimes when the wind slipped through the cracks, it would sway gently, and I could almost hear the soft steps of his boots on the canvas floor, the slowing rhythm of his breath beneath my hand, the faint creak of the wood when I sat beside his cot. I didn't need photographs or letters. What remained was him, the coat, too white to forget, too stained to forgive. Over time, I hung other things on that same wall. A rosary, a frame of dried flowers, a linen handkerchief I inherited from my mother. But nothing spoke to me like that silent piece of cloth. It was as if it was still waiting, for forgiveness, for confession, for a chance to be burned, maybe, to let burn everything it still held inside. But I never found the courage, because in that coat, the echo remained, the echo of a woman who, in saving a man, lost herself, and in losing him, never again managed to fully dress herself in who she used to be. Chicago has a kind of winter that doesn't warn you. It doesn't arrive gently, like the seasons in books. It invades. Tears autumn apart with cutting wind, stiffens the wooden window frames, makes bones creak, and memories wake up. And it's always with the first snow of the year that I go back to Warsaw, without leaving my chair. There's something about snow that reminds me of him. Maybe it's the color, the same as the sheet that covered his chest, or the muffled sound it makes as it falls, like his footsteps fading into the dark that last night. Or maybe it's just the cold itself, that specific kind of cold that hurts the hands, but wounds you even deeper inside, because that's when I feel him closest. I still see him, not exactly as he was, but as my memory insists on keeping him. That serious face, not hard, just solemn. Those deep eyes, always carrying a question he never asked out loud, and that quiet way of existing like a forgotten prayer. When snow lands on the edge of my window, I can almost hear the canvas tent rustling, the creak of his boots, his breath slowing in the dark. And then, for a moment, too brief to hold, but long enough to ache, he's there. Sometimes I catch myself whispering to him. Not full sentences, just fragments. "It was hard," I say. Or, "Do you remember the blue scarf?" Other times I just press my fingers to the frozen glass, as if that touch might reach him, wherever he is. He never answers. But I never expect him to. Some presences don't need to speak. They just need to stay. People have told me I should have let go, that what can't be lived should be left behind. But how do you let go of someone who became part of your body, part of your soul? The world may have moved on. I did too, in my own way. I worked, I aged, I got sick. But there are parts of me still frozen in that night I let him go. And every winter when the snow begins to fall, they come back. Sometimes when the city goes quiet, I hear a sound only I know the source of. The zip of the tent, the clink of a metal button, the short whistle he used to make without realizing. And I smile. That bitter kind of smile. The kind that pulls from your whole body. The kind you give when you remember something too old to forget and too deep to explain. I don't know if he survived. I don't know if he built a life, married, told our story to someone else. But here, from the top of my dusty attic, where time hides in the cracks and old furniture, he's still alive. Not in photographs, not in books. He lives in small things, in the steam of the kettle, in the creak of the chair, and above all, in the snow. Because some loves don't have to keep going to never truly end. Some secrets we carry like medals, others like scars. Mine, I carried like a silent cross, stitched between the folds of memory. I never asked to feel what I felt, but I never managed to forget either. And maybe forgetting would have been the worst kind of betrayal. I don't regret loving him. What I do regret, maybe, is staying silent for so long, letting the world decide what I was allowed to feel, and for whom. Because if the war taught me anything, it's that there's no right side when it comes to love. There's only the human side. And that's exactly what they tried to erase from me. Today at 91, I don't carry the urgency I once did. The chair where I sit creaks slowly, as if it knows it's holding more than an old body. It carries stories that never fit in spoken words. War stories, yes, but also stories of tenderness, of risky choices, of feelings that were never given permission to exist. And yet, they existed. Many think the worst traumas of war are the screams, the explosions, the broken bodies. But there are wounds no one sees. Wounds that open with a glance, that sting when the northern wind blows, that bleed every time memory knocks. His absence is one of those wounds. It isn't visible, but it lives with me. Sometimes it sits with me at the table. Other times it sleeps curled under the blankets on the chair. And almost always, it whispers his name when everything else falls silent. Maybe you too carry a secret like that. A name hidden in a corner of your chest that no one's ever heard. A love story that time and reason told you to bury. If that's the case, know you're not alone. I understand you. And that's why I chose to tell this story. Not to shock, not to seek comfort, but because some stories need to be spoken before they turn to dust forever. And if a whole lifetime wasn't enough to live it, maybe a few words are enough to let it breathe. If you made it this far, listening to every piece of this emotional story, from the bottom of my heart, thank you. Thank you for listening with respect, for allowing this old woman to open a door that's been locked for so long. Stories like this don't live in books. They live in the eyes of women who grew old in silence, who cared for everyone, who chose to stay quiet out of love, but who now deserve to be heard. If this story touched you, write to me. Tell me. Leave a comment saying you too carry memories the world never understood. Like the video, subscribe to the channel, and share it with someone who, just like us, once loved a love that didn't fit the rules. Because some wars aren't won with weapons. They're won when someone is willing to listen. And to listen, my dear, is one of the bravest things left in this noisy world.